It was Sunday, a very important Sunday, and the church had gathered to celebrate and to enjoy one another's company on this great day. But it was also a moment when they were feeling particular anxiety for the future of the church. And there were a few things that caused this anxiety. You see, the church had once enjoyed many privileges within society. When it met on Sunday mornings, for example, the society would often cancel any other activities, giving people nothing better to do than to attend church. In addition, the society often deferred to church leaders and adopted their moral teachings as their own. Many other advantages had been given to the church, but were no longer being extended to the church in these days. And this loss, while not exactly being a classic case of the persecution of the church, kind of felt like persecution to many people. And it made them worry and fret for the future. Another anxiety, frankly, was leadership. Maybe it was a sign of difficult times, and people were too preoccupied with paying the bills and just getting by, but people just weren't stepping forward and offering their leadership and the support to the church like they once did. Another perennial worry? Yep, money. Oh, they almost hated to admit it, but it was true. The good work of the church required money to be carried out, and because so many people seem to struggle paying bills these days, the money did not always appear when they thought that it should. And so, of course, that also created a lot of anxiety. And so one of the members of the church stood and began to beseech God on behalf of them all. "Oh, Lord," he began to pray, "I pray for the church and for the challenges we face. We recognize that society has now turned against us, that they are trying to cancel us, that nobody wants to play with us anymore." As I was saying, Lord, no one is interested in coming into the church anymore. They seem to have decided we're just irrelevant, that we have nothing worthwhile to say about the world's problems. But it's they who have decided to make us irrelevant by excluding us from the conversation, or telling us we can't have the conversation on our own terms. "Oh, Lord, why don't you hear us when we call?" Oh my God, it's so hard to even pray properly with all of these interruptions. Do you see how hard it's getting? Why don't you help us, God? The elder then sat down. But since the anxieties of the church had hardly all been expressed, another soon stood and began to pray as well. "Oh, Lord," she cried, "it is sadly true that no one wants to do the work of the church these days. They're too busy doing other things, like playing sports on Sundays. You know, there was a time when people were only too happy to volunteer their time to the church. If only you would send us people, maybe people with young families, who would step forward and volunteer to do the work of the church. Oh, that would be so awesome. Oh my..." Rhoda, where are you? Go to that door and tell whoever that is, whoever won't stop knocking, that we're busy in here. We're holding an important prayer meeting because the church is facing many crises. Tell them to leave us in peace. Rhoda, you see, was the church custodian. And she did a lot of the cleaning and organizing around the building. And part of her job description was also to handle matters of security and, make sure the doors were opened when they needed to be opened and locked when they needed to be locked. And since she was kind of the only employee of the church, well, people tended to look to her for all kinds of other things as well. She made sure to set everything up for important meetings like this one. She often answered the phones, and so yes, she was the one who was asked to take care of the disturbance at the door. She was the one who had to go and look at the door. But meanwhile, of course, the good people of the church, they continued their prayers. A third respected member of the church was standing and praying on behalf of them all. "Oh, Lord," he cried, "I hate to bring it up, but there is the matter of paying the bills. Money is short, and it's a constant struggle. Oh, if only you would see fit to provide us with a boost to our bank account and make it so we don't have to worry about keeping the lights on and the heat going. That would be so nice." At least the prayer went something like that. Honestly, the people were a little bit too distracted by the disturbance at the door. They couldn't help but hear as Rhoda's feet shuffled towards the door, and then there was this odd, semi-whispered discussion that none of them could quite make out. But they could pick up on the emotions, and were surprised to hear how excited Rhoda was at the muffled responses on the other side of the door. And so just as the latest prayer wound up with a very sophisticated prayer request for a good return on the church's investments, they were all annoyed to be interrupted once again by the sound of Rhoda running into the sanctuary. "They're here," she cried. "All the answers to your prayers. They're standing just outside the door. They've been knocking all this time. Do you think I should let them in?" Well, as you can imagine, the entire church erupted with outrage. "What are you doing, Rhoda, you foolish girl? Don't you know better than to interrupt us at our important prayers? We're doing the important work of the church here. A bit of reverence and decorum, a bit of respect, if you please." But for some reason, all of their criticisms did nothing to temper Rhoda's excitement. And she cried out even more loudly that they didn't need to pray. God had already answered. By the time they came to understand what she was saying, and it took some time because they weren't really trying to listen, it only outraged them all the more. "You silly girl," they said. "You must be out of your mind. What do you know about prayers and answering prayers? You probably just saw an angel, and you're not supposed to take those literally. We're the experts on that. We will say what an answer to prayer is, not the custodian." So Rhoda left. I mean, what was she supposed to do? She went out and she met with the one who was knocking at the door. And the last I heard, the people of the church were still praying to God to save the church. I don't know if the author of the book of Acts realized it at the time, but I believe in this story that he told of Peter and Rhoda at the door, he offered a wonderful metaphor for the way that the church has often behaved down through the ages. I'm sure he did, by the way, realize how humorous his story was. He had to be laughing into his sleeve as he wrote it down. Oh, the irony. The church praying inside, well, the literal answer to their prayers is knocking on the door outside and can't get in. What's more, they don't even want to open the door because they don't believe the answer could be there. It is an amusing situation, but I think it's one that does shine a light on the church and is there to make us think about how we operate. Because it's not just a story about something that happened once. It's a story about something that keeps on happening, and it's a story we need to learn from. Throughout history, the church has been in crisis again and again and again and again. the church has responded by praying, of course, imploring God for salvation. And God has always sent that salvation. Always. The proof of that is that, well, the church is still there, still here, still in existence, some 2,000 years later. But see, what's often happened is that the salvation of the church has been knocking on the door all along, but the church couldn't recognize the salvation that's standing out there. Take the 5th century, for example. In the 5th century, the Roman Empire was crumbling in the West because of barbarian invasions. And the church, by this point so tightly integrated with the empire, felt that this was horrible, of course. That this was not only the end of the church, but quite likely the end of the world. And so they prayed. They prayed to God to save the church. But here's the thing, the salvation that God sent at that moment was already knocking on the door. It was just not the salvation they were looking for. You see, the so-called barbarians themselves proved to be the salvation of the church in that age, as they converted in huge numbers. And yes, that was a transition that changed the church in innumerable ways. But the church also found new vitality within the new culture. And that's a pattern that has been repeated again and again. The church felt threatened by the reformers in the 16th century. And they prayed to God to make the threat of reform go away. But guess what answer God sent them? God sent them new vitality, yes, but it came in the form of reform. Both the existing Roman Catholic Church, which was reformed at the Council of Trent, and of course the new Reformed churches that grew up with wonderful new vitality at that time. See, the answer was banging at the door. The problem was they didn't want to open the door to such reform. And I can't help but think that today we're dealing with the same thing. We do feel like the survival of the church is at stake today. When forces of society seem more intent on bringing us down than maybe ever before. And I think we're dealing with the same problem. Even as we pray to God to save us, I think we might be ignoring the sound of the answer to our prayers as it knocks at the door. Even more importantly, there are Rhodas among us who are aware of what's coming for the church, who are aware of what is knocking at the door of the church. And we've been dismissing them and mocking them for coming and telling us about it. Who's knocking at the church today, the door of the church today? Well, probably, for one thing, growing numbers of minorities and immigrant groups who are looking for ways to worship God while still holding on to their cultural identity. And when Rhoda comes running back into the room shouting that God has sent many such people to be part of the future of the church, how do we respond? Do we ridicule her? We tell her she's out of her mind? And if we do that, is that because we really believe that, or because we're not willing to accept the change that would come to the church if we allowed such people to have a voice and power within the church? And I think we probably could say to a certain extent the same thing about a younger generation. Now, is the younger generation literally at the door of the church knocking to get in these days? Not that often. Not that often right around now. But I don't think that's necessarily because the church or the gospel has nothing to offer a younger generation. I think what's been going on is that we've been more proactive about keeping younger people away. And it has to do with the way we've treated the Rhodas among us, shutting down their efforts to bring the change that would make a place for younger generations. And because of that, we've already convinced so many there really is no place for them in the church. But here, my friends, is the bottom line. As far as I'm concerned, God cares about the church. God answers our prayers for the church. Not always in the ways we want or expect, but God answers our prayers. And so there is some answer to our prayers, knocking at the door. God, send us a Rhoda or two. Send us someone who's not afraid to go to the door and discern who's out there. God, give us the courage to become a Rhoda. Give you the courage, me the courage. Most of all, God give us all the courage and the wisdom to listen to Rhoda when she speaks up. Lord our God, we recognize the challenges we face. We recognize and thank you that you answer our prayers for the church. Help us to recognize that answer when it arrives. Let us open the door. Amen.